when you have that list, you've actually already started to reclaim your power, right? Because awareness is the first step in taking any sort of action if you want to take it. Once you are aware, then you can decide if you're ready to make any changes to any of those behaviors in your life. But one of the main reasons, I started out this podcast by saying, like, not only 9% of New Year's resolutions actually manifest into reality. One of the main reasons why, according to studies, one of the main reasons why New Year's resolutions don't work is because the person's not ready to change, or they don't feel the need to change. So with this Beyond Labels New Year's Resolutions Challenge, don't pressure yourself to change.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Beyond Labels podcast with Joel Salatin, yours truly, our farmer, and our favorite researcher, Dr. Sina McCullough. Happy New Year, everyone. We know this is coming to you right about the New Year time. So we're gonna discuss New Year's resolutions a little bit with a little bit of a different take from a study that Sina has just read about human behavior in groups and the expectations of behavior and obedience. And so then we'll each talk about some of our New Year's thoughts as we enter the program. So Sina, take it away with the study.
All right. Thanks, Joel. Okay. As you know, this is the time of the year when a lot of us set goals for ourselves for the new year. But did you know that only about 9% of Americans who make resolutions actually complete them? So like 91% of our New Year's resolutions fail, right? So, and I have to admit, I've been in that category many a times. In fact, I actually stopped making New Year's resolutions a few years ago because I was like, I'm just setting myself up to fail here. But I came up with a different twist on New Year's resolutions for this year, just for our Beyond Labels listeners. And so it was based on a study that I read. I want to quickly share that study, and then I want to offer the Beyond Labels New Year's Resolution Challenge, which I'm calling Take Back Your Power. Okay, so I don't think many people realize, but I actually studied animal and human behavior in college. My bachelor's of science was in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior. So this is a very interesting subject for me. And I tend to look for studies that talk about behavior and find the patterns and the nuances in our population. Okay, so recently I read a study from, it was from a Yale University psychologist named Stanley Milgram. He carried out one of the most famous studies of obedience in all of psychology. Do you already know what it is? Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I've read about this before at numerous places. So no, this is good. This is good territory, and it's still every time I hear about it or read about it in a different context, it still is it's shocking.
That will make sense to everybody who hasn't heard of it in just a moment. Okay,
in just a minute. That's right. That's right.
Okay, so Milgram, he studied the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. He wanted to see how far someone would go in obeying an instruction, even if it involved harming another person, right? So specifically, he was trying to figure out, why did the people go along with genocide during World War II? Because their defense was based on obedience. So he sought out to answer the question, were they really just following orders from their superiors? So in 1961, he did an experiment. It was 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50, all different range of professions. The participants were paired with another person. So they were actually introduced to that other person. And then they drew lots to find out who would be a, quote, learner and who would be a teacher. But what the participants didn't know is that the draw was actually fixed. So the participant was always the teacher, and the learner was an actor, just pretending to be a participant. Okay. There was also a, quote, experimenter that would be in the room with the learner. And the experimenter posed as a scientist, dressed in a lab coat, but the experimenter was also an actor. Okay. They used two rooms. One room was where the learner, the actor, was placed, and that person was in an electric chair, and electrodes were actually strapped to his arm. There was another room right next to it that was for the teacher and the experimenter. Okay. Now remember, the teacher is the one that is the actual participant. So the teacher and the experimenter were in this room, and it was set up with an electric shock generator, and there were switches in front of the teacher, and they would increase in voltage, right? So the learner, the actor, was supposed to learn a list of word pairs. And then the teacher, who was the real participant, would test the learner. He would test him by naming one of the words, and the actor had to recall the pair. If the actor made a mistake, the teacher, who was the actual participant, was told to administer an electric shock. And each time that actor made a mistake, the level of the shock was supposed to increase. Okay. So there were 30 switches.
Just so we really understand this, Sina, because it really is a fascinating study. So the actor who is answering the questions is not actually being shocked, but he's acting like he's being shocked.
Yes.
He's acting like he's being shocked. Just so we, I mean, I don't want to,
yeah.
I don't want to get everybody a bad feeling about behavioral scientists here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no. So there were 30 switches, and they ranged from 15 volts, which is like a slight shock, all the way to 450 volts. Well, that's a severe shock, and like at sustained levels, it can cause death. Okay. So the one who was the teacher had all these switches in front of him, and the teacher, who was the real participant, thought it was real. So the teacher actually thought if they pushed on the button, they were shocking the actor. The actor knew it wasn't real. All right. The actor played along. And so during the experiment, the actor was instructed to give mainly wrong answers on purpose. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so each time they gave a wrong answer, the teacher was instructed by the scientist who was in the room, the experimenter, the one wearing the lab coat. They was instructed to give the shock. And if the teacher refused to administer the shock, the experimenter gave a series of different prods or different orders in order to try to get them to continue with giving the shocks. Okay. So the results, about 65% of all the participants, all the quote unquote teachers, they continued to give the shocks all the way to the highest level of 450 volts. Right? Even though they knew that was the dangerous shock that can result in death. So almost 2/3 of all of the actual participants shocked the other human all the way to the highest level. And then every single participant continued up to the 300 volt level, which is still a pretty severe shock. So this was actually pretty shocking. To be nerdy, this was actually shocking to a lot of researchers and scientists at the time. And certain conclusions were drawn from the experiment. The first was that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human. So in other words, we will conform. And Milgram thought that this was because our conforming would allow society to function in an organized fashion. The other conclusion was that the obedience to authority is actually ingrained in all of us from the way we were brought up, that it's learned from a variety of situations from, for example, family, school, or the workplace. Okay. And now his study has actually been repeated many, many times. And I'll be the first to say, I find flaws in studies. There were flaws in his study. Undoubtedly, every study has flaws, and Milgram's study had flaws. But so he repeated 18 different variations of it. In total, 636 participants. All the results were similar. His findings have also been replicated by a variety of researchers from a variety of different cultures. And almost every single one of them came to the same conclusion as Milgram's original study, that it was the majority of people that would shock the other person all the way to the extreme. Okay. Milgram tried to explain this behavior. And so he came up with what's called the Milgram's agency theory. So he said that people have two states of behavior when they're in social situations. The first is the autonomous state. The people direct their own actions and they will take responsibility for the results of their own actions, right? The second state is called an agentic state. This is when people allow others to direct their actions, and then they pass off the responsibility for the consequences to the person giving the order. So in other words, the person might say, oh, well, he told me to do it. Right? That would be the rationale, the actual thinking of them. So they are actually agents for another person's will. They're acting as agents for another person's will. In order to get to that agentic state, Milgram said you had to have two conditions met. The first is the person giving the order has to be perceived as qualified. They like some kind of expert. They're seen as legitimate. So, for instance, in his study, the experimenter that was in the room that was prodding the participant, they had that lab coat on, right? That lab coat made a difference because Milgram carried out a variation of the study in which that experimenter, the one wearing the lab coat, he was actually called away at the start of the procedure. And then somebody took over his role in the experiment, and that person was another actor who was wearing regular clothes. When that happened, the obedience dropped. It was like 65% going all the way to the 450 volts. The obedience dropped to 20%. So the perception of authority of a qualified expert played a huge role in obedience. And we've talked about this on the program before, about how much your perception matters. The lab coats symbolize scientific authority, which caused them to increase obedience. We do this too, like with medical doctors, right? In their lab coats, and we acquiesce, right? We perceive them as legitimate authoritarian figures or as experts. So we outsource our power to them. It's the same thing that Milgram had found in his study. Okay. Now, the second condition that has to be met for a person to enter this agentic state is the person who is being ordered has to believe that the authority will accept responsibility for whatever the outcome happens to be. So in Milgram's study, if participants were reminded that they were responsible for their own actions, almost none of the subjects obeyed. But when participants were refusing to go on, if the experimenter said that they would take responsibility, most of them did. Like they would keep going if the experimenter said, no, we're responsible for it, right? And it goes back to the excuse. Oh, they told me to do it. I was just following orders. Okay. So I read this study and it sparked this conversation between Donnie and I, where we started to explore different areas in our lives where we are either knowingly or unknowingly giving away our power, right, to some perceived expert or authoritarian figure. So in other words, we asked ourselves, where in our lives are we being the teacher in this experiment? Where are we blindly consenting and choosing to outsource our power? And so we started to make a list. So I was hoping that you and I, Joel, can talk a little bit about where we have done this in the past, or maybe are still doing this, right? And this is the first part of the New Year's Eve challenge, and then there'll be a second part. Okay, so to touch on our list, one is scientists, right? Just like in Milgram's study, I was raised in the system where I outsourced my power to other scientists, right? I elevate their studies, even sometimes above what my intuition may tell me. Like, I don't really do that anymore, but this is what I used to do. Okay. And I think that this is pervasive in our culture, where we will largely elevate the status of scientific studies above our own intuition. All right. Teachers. Teachers are an easy one where people will give them responsibility for teaching their kids, right? They'll hand over that authority to them. Professors in college. I used to have a very high opinion of professors in college till I went through the system, and that one changed. But we, just like the scientists in the lab coat, we do tend to elevate professors, and that's one reason why we send our kids off to college to go be taught by these quote unquote experts, right?
Right.
And then we have obviously the obvious ones, the medical doctors, the dentists, nurses, registered dietitians, even things like on a more subtle level, like cell phones. Most of us use cell phones every day, and we tend to keep them on during the day. And that implies that to at least some extent, we are trusting what the government and the telecommunications industry tells us about the safety of cell phones, right? So instead of us maybe looking into it for ourselves and really deciding, do we think it's safe? I bet most of us have not actually done a deep dive into that research. We're just trusting those quote unquote authoritarian organizations and figures when they tell us it's safe. Another example is homeowners association. You're allowing someone else to tell you what you can and cannot do with your land, right? So that's food labels. Food labels are a big one, right? We tend to trust the labels, and this is my last example, and I'm going to throw it over to you for your examples. This was a huge area for me for outsourcing my power, right? Because I, as you know, and our listeners know, my story of severe sickness to the point of almost dying. And part of that was because I trusted the labels. And I started to think about that in the terms of Milgram's experiment. And I was thinking that, when we hand over our agency, we are in essence handing over responsibility for our own actions, like Milgram said. That may be why we perceive ourselves, when we're in that state, we perceive ourselves as victims or helpless, or shift the blame onto the companies. So you've seen this in the health field where it's like, oh, well, my genes are my destiny, right? So that's not actually my fault, right? That's just a way to shift the blame away from yourself. And now I did this with our food supply. When I was blindly consenting to the food, when I blindly believed that everything in the grocery store was safe, and then I realized it wasn't, I got angry. But I was at first angry with the government and the food companies, right? I was blaming them. I put the responsibility on them for quote unquote making me sick. This is similar to what Milgram observed in his experiments. So when people obeyed, they viewed the person as an authoritarian figure or an expert, as more knowledgeable than themselves. And so they shifted the responsibility onto that person, right? He told me to do it. In my case, the wording wasn't, oh, he told me to do it. It was, they told me it was safe, right? So just like those participants perceived that experimenter as an expert and they outsourced their power to him, I perceived the food industry and the government as an expert, and I outsourced my power to them. In other words, I ate the food without questioning it. So these are some examples to show how we do this. So Milgram figured this out, this pattern of what it would take for us to not follow our own conscience and to outsource the power, and then why we would do that. And so our first part of the challenge for the New Year's resolution is, let's bring awareness to areas in our lives where we are unknowingly giving away our power. In other words, where we're being the teacher in the situation, and make a list of those, either in your mind or on a piece of paper. Make a list of all of those areas. Now, that's it. That's the whole New Year's resolution for part A. If you want to accept it, it's very simple and doable, because when you have that list, you've actually already started to reclaim your power, right? Because awareness is the first step in taking any sort of action if you want to take it. Once you are aware, then you can decide if you're ready to make any changes to any of those behaviors in your life. But one of the main reasons, I started out this podcast by saying, like, not only 9% of New Year's resolutions actually manifest into reality. One of the main reasons why, according to studies, One of the main reasons why New Year's resolutions don't work is because the person's not ready to change, or they don't feel the need to change. So with this Beyond Labels New Year's resolutions challenge, don't pressure yourself to change. Just bring awareness into your life. And that's a huge, huge step. So making this list mentally or on paper, give yourself a pat on the back, because you've already achieved a huge step forward in eventually making a change if you want to. Okay, so that's part one. So Joel, I want to know, what is your list of, in your life, things that you have it's handed your power over to, maybe in the past, or maybe that you still are?
Yeah. So, it's hard to compete with what you've done there, but I kind of made two lists, Sina, as I was preparing for this. I made a list of what I thought I had done well, empowered myself, and I made a list of things that are challenging, that are hard to empower myself.
I love that.
And so here are some things. Here are some things that I think I've done well, that have empowered me, and people who know me know that I'm still on the on the little flip phone. Okay, so I don't have a smartphone. So I hear about, those things actually listen to you while you're, when they're off, and all this stuff, the tracking and all the stuff that's going on. And so I'm just being, I've never opened an app. I don't have any apps. And I don't think apps are evil, but when we talk about giving over to somebody else that power to speak into us, and take our time, and take our whatever, our thoughts. Another one, I have never played a video game. Not a single one. I've never played a single video game. Not even Pac-Man, not brick or brack or whatever. I've never played a single video game. And again, I don't think all video games are evil or wrong. But if I've got time to do a video game, I'd rather read an edifying book or something. I just that's me. I'm old school. I'm not into that electronic. And I just see. In fact, one of our checkouts here this week, she has a flip phone. She also has a smartphone, and she makes a point of leaving the smartphone like in her house. In other words, going away without it, just as a way to kind of, wean away from that whole. From that, just having to look at it all the time, and what's going on. Another one is social media. I have no Instagram, no social media. All of my social media is through Polyface, the business, which brings me to another good one. I think is having a business. I think, my mentor, Alan Nation, said every single person should have a business in order to enjoy your life with pre-tax dollars. The business can own your car. It can take you out to dinner. It can entertain friends. It can buy your clothes. It can take you to seminars and conventions and whatever. The point is, a business can bleed off your income to where you don't have to pay any taxes. And if there's one thing I want to defund and disempower, it's the federal government. And so a lot of people don't realize that most of our lives, Teresa and I, have lived below the poverty level. We live very well, but it's because the business picks up all the expenses, and you don't need very much to live on something else. On actual taxable income. Years and years ago, we built up enough savings that neither one of us has any life insurance. We once the kids were gone, we didn't have debts. We didn't have that sort of thing. And so I canceled all the life insurance. We have no life insurance. We got plenty of money to, we're not going to have an expensive funeral anyway. We've got a spot up here on the hill, where we're going to, of course, I'm telling you, throw me in a compost pile. That's really cheap. But this whole, get yourself in a place where you don't need life insurance because you have enough savings or enough wherewithal to bury yourself and get you up and running. Obamacare eliminated our medical insurance, so we don't have medical insurance, but we do have Samaritan's Ministry, the medical sharing thing. And there's 4 or 5 of these companies that are doing this now, and we love it. So those are some of the things that I think I've done well. And if I may say, Sina, I think a lot of times where I hear people, what they're saying is, I can't. They feel, number one, they've given over their empowerment to a job. And I know for us, when I left outside employment, came back to the farm full time, leaving that paycheck was, well, a lot of people would say it was irresponsible, that it was whatever. But I realized that as long as I depended on that paycheck from that job, I would be shackled to somebody else's power over my schedule, my time, my goals. And I realized, you know what? If we don't make it on the farm, and there was a lot of reason to think we weren't going to, but said, if we don't, I'm willing to wash dishes in a restaurant, if I need to put food on the table, until we can get our. The fact is, if you give 120% and you're loyal and you're responsible and you show up on time, the particular job you're in today has no control over you, because you could work for anybody.
Thank you for joining us on Beyond Labels. Our mission with this podcast is to make it accessible to everyone.
But we are behind a paywall because the issues we discuss are often subject to censorship. We've run into that, and so we have an extremely modest paywall to let us have the freedom to discuss the kind of issues we want to discuss in the way we want to discuss them. And you can become a member and enjoy all this content by clicking on the description box below. We look forward to having you join our family.